Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Sirine Hout, and I am giving you the lecture today on Edward Said's Orientalism. And I'm happy to do so. I've given this lecture before, and students usually liked it, so I hope that this generation will be very much in the spirit of previous ones. You have a handout in your hands, so you can follow my lecture by simply going through the handout. I'm very organized, and I will be... This doesn't work anymore. Oh. Do you have to press anything? Hello?
Something wrong?
No, it just stopped.
It just stopped? Are you sure? Try again.
Hello? Okay. Okay, you're saying throughout the lecture.
You can try this one if you want.
Oh, is it better? Oh. Hello? No.
One second, it's ready. No.
Hello?
No.
Testing. Testing. Testing.
Okay, no, then we
It's
need
dead.
to use the other one.
Yeah. All right. Okay. I will be discussing some paintings during this lecture. So this will be one of them. There will be basically a total of 2, and I will not be showing you the handout in big print as regular PowerPoint presentations do, because I think it's totally unnecessary since it's already in your hands. But since this is a visual component of the discourse, I want it to be laid out in front of you. So I will start basically by telling you a little bit about his life. Edward Said was born in 1935 in Jerusalem, before obviously the occupation of Palestine in 1948, and he passed away in 2003. A classical pianist, an opera lover, a member of the Palestinian National Council between 1977 and 1991, a courageous defender of Palestinian human and political rights, a public figure with countless TV appearances, a much sought-after professor, a critic of literature, history, philosophy, the media, culture, music, the arts, and politics, a husband to a Lebanese woman, Mrs. Mariam Qortas, and the father of now 2 grown-up children. And fortunately, my former PhD thesis advisor at Columbia University in the mid-1990s, Edward Wadi' Said, was truly a Renaissance man. Controversial in his multifaceted work, Said had both admirers and detractors, if not downright political opponents and enemies. Those who loved him worshipped him, and those who hated him issued death threats and called him a professor of terror, as he was once maligned in a magazine called Commentary because he was photographed in southern Lebanon, Biljnoub, throwing a stone at an Israeli guardhouse, of course in occupied Palestine, although he explained that this gesture later on was only symbolic and that he did not aim the stone at any particular individual. Columbia University in New York City, where he worked all his life, never, of course, bothered to take these slanderous statements seriously. Furthermore, Harvard University tried to hire him on many occasions. He, by the way, got his PhD from Harvard, but he loved the cosmopolitanism and the thriving cultural scene of New York, calling, by contrast, Cambridge in Massachusetts, where Harvard is, a conservative little village in comparison to, of course, the Big Apple or New York. Said was born to a wealthy Protestant family in Jerusalem on November 1st, 1935, when Palestine was under the British Mandate. He spent much of his childhood, along with his 4 younger sisters, in Cairo, Egypt, and sometimes also traveling to spend some time in Beirut, but mostly in the mountains during summer vacations. At the age of 14, he moved with his parents to the United States, where he obtained his BA from Princeton University in '57 and his PhD, as I told you, from Harvard in '64. In 1977, he became a member of the Palestine National Council, the PNC, which is a provisional parliament that was established with the goal of pursuing eventual Palestinian nationhood. In the early 1990s, he was diagnosed with chronic leukemia. I was in his office when he got that phone call from his doctor, by the way. Which he battled for 13 years, succumbing finally to his illness on September 25, 2003, at the age of 68, in his own apartment in Manhattan, a stone throw away from Columbia University. He is buried in Brummana, Lebanon. You can go visit his grave anytime you happen to be in Brummana. A few words about his works and legacy before we get to the sort of meat and potatoes of his book. Saeed has written hundreds of articles in on various subjects. He has authored and or occasionally co-authored over 20 books to his name. I can give you many titles, but I will not bother with that because you can read them or at least find about some of them from your fly sheet. Some of them I would like to mention, however, were published after he passed away, thanks to, of course, the continuous efforts of his fans and his wife and his critics. I would like to mention, however, one particular book which he wrote and was fond of, and that is his own autobiography, which he titled Out of Place, and it was translated into Arabic as Kharij al-Makan, and it's been translated, of course, into many languages, and that was published in 1999. He always told me that he loved to write a novel, but that he was better at comparative thinking than perhaps creative production. But that was, he said, what he came closest to in producing as a sort of Bildungsroman by writing about his own life from a distance, both a temporal and a spatial distance. You'd also be interested in knowing that there's a movie that you could watch based on this autobiography, which is a 138-minute documentary called Out of Place, Memories of Edward Said, that was done by the Japanese director Sato Makoto, and it was released in 2006. I assume you can find it on YouTube. It was filmed in Palestine, of course, today unfortunately called Israel, Lebanon, Egypt, and the United States. It traces Said's childhood influences and celebrates his intellectual legacy. If you Google his name today, I mean, between yesterday and today, before I came to stand in front of you, I'm sure you would find even newer entries. There are many books and studies about him. And, you know, since he passed away as well. I will now move to Roman numeral 3 by talking a little bit about some of the major literary and historical events in the Orientalist tradition. After all, we will be looking more closely today at his book, published in 1978, on Orientalism. He coined the term, by the way. He is the one who coined the term. Before him, the Oriental Renaissance had been coined in 1832 by a Frenchman called Edgar Quinet, but he was the one who coined the term and turned it into a discourse because of the ISM. This is called a suffix in English, so it became a discourse because of the way he analyzed it. So a few big events took place in the 18th century, what we refer to today as the Age of Enlightenment, l'âge des Lumières, and so on and so forth, that basically led to what he perceives later on as the systematic onset of the discourse of Orientalism. And one of them, which is never to be underestimated or devalued or somehow downplayed, and that is the compilation and the translation of the 1001 Nights, Alf Layla wa Layla. And those were translated for the first time from their original languages. And by the way, they originally come from 3 different distinct literary traditions. One is Persia, today Iran, one is India, and the other one is the Arab world. A man by the name of Antoine Galland, he was actually a French Arabist who made it to Lebanon in the early 18th century. He spent a lot of time in the mountains with Maronite monks, from whom he received a lot of those original stories that, of course, had been oral stories originally. And he went back to France and he translated those for the first time in a very sanitized French, of course, between 1704 and 1717. And that opened up a whole new vista for the European imagination about what the East is and entails, and what the Westerner, the traveler, the thinker, the writer, the novelist, the fabulist can actually do with this exotic materials coming from and written about in the East. The second major discovery was made by a man called William Jones. He was from England, and in 1786, he discovered the language of Sanskrit while he was on a tour of India. And you might think, you might wonder why this is so important, but it is important because until then, most European, if not all intellectuals, had thought that Hebrew was the oldest language in the world. And of course, you know that the Judeo-Christian tradition is called that for a reason. It all started in the Holy Land, right? I mean, Jesus Christ himself was Jewish. He spoke in Aramaic, actually, when he was alive, but nonetheless. So this discovery, again, caused shockwaves, if you like, because it showed the Western mind that there are many, many languages and civilizations that lie to the east of Europe, which are by far more ancient than even the so-called gravity center, which is where we are now, namely the Fertile Crescent or the Near East, or what came in the 20th century to be called the Middle East, thanks to Israel being on the map. Also, until the middle of the 18th century, Orientalists were biblical scholars. They were much more interested in philology, in questions of language, semiotics, translations, rather than the actual Orient as such. So it was a much more textual approach in more ways than one. 1832, Oriental Renaissance was coined as a term, as I said, by Edgar Quinet. Now we come to the book itself, which is Orientalism. And as I told you, the ISM at the end signifies a discourse, okay? Like feminism, as you saw recently in the case of The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir, like Marxism, like many others, capitalism, socialism, National Socialism, fascism. All of these, of course, are discourses as signaled by their suffixes. I would like to mention two important, really intellectual giants that had a major effect on Edward Said. I mean, even giants have to stand on the shoulders of others. And Edward Said was one of them. And there are two major people to whom he owes a lot in terms of legacy. And I will mention one being called, the main French philosopher, one of the main ones of the 20th century by the name of Michel Foucault. You may have heard his name. And the other one is an Italian political theorist by the name of Antonio Gramsci. Okay, so Michel Foucault and Antonio Gramsci, each in his own and distinct way, left a mark on his own thinking, on Edward Said's thinking, that helped him shape the rationale of Orientalism. Now, what did Michel Foucault do? Well, he did many things, but I will only mention one thing that is of central significance to us, and that is Michel Foucault's insistence on the notion that knowledge is always political. You should remember this. If you remember that, you remember already 50% of what Orientalism is all about. Knowledge, as such, might be innocuous, as in neutral in terms of how it may be used, but knowledge is always used. That's the whole issue. And it's always used for political purposes, according to Foucault. And power is also always exercised. You exercise power. You don't just possess power. If you possess it and you don't exercise it, you're not really powerful. So according to him also, power is never localized, but power infiltrates every aspect of life at a given time, in a given time period, to shape a certain discourse. So there's a distinct relationship between power and knowledge in both scholarly and popular thinking, especially with regard to European views of the Islamic Arab world. And the relationship between knowledge and power is dialectical. What this means is that the more knowledge you have of something, the more you will be able to control it and have power over it. But the more power you have over it, the better position you'll be in to gain further knowledge about it. It's the snowball effect. You know what happens to a snowball once it starts coming down the slope? It becomes bigger and bigger thanks to momentum, right? So Edward Said really sort of hooked on to this formula, and he said this is what happens, especially in Orientalism. The Westerners came with Bonaparte eventually, and they set their tents and their offices, and they gained power over the Orient. And while they were there, they acquired more knowledge, which helped them to colonize the Arabs even further. Okay, I would like to mention one thing, however, that I should have mentioned perhaps earlier, is that when we talk about the Orient, when Edward Said says Orient, he doesn't only mean the Arab and Muslim world. Please make note of this. By Orient, he means anything that lies to the east and to the south of the European continent. Okay, so when we're talking about the Orient, we include the Far East, الشرق الأقصى, مش بس الشرق الأدنى, which is ours. So it includes Japan, it includes, of course, China, Asia, India, and all of Africa. So please remember that. Now, the work of Antonio Gramsci, the Italian political theorist who spent time in jail, by the way, is very important, and the most important notion that Edward Said took over from Gramsci and applied to his discourse on Orientalism is the notion of hegemony. Hegemony is a word you hear about almost every day if you only, watch the news or read the papers. Al-Haymana, right? We talk about Al-Haymana al-Amerikiyya, Al-Haymana, whatever, Haymanat ad-Dollar even, like when we're talking about sort of dollar imperialism or... So the word hegemony is important, and Edward Said thinks that Orientalism cannot be understood without this sort of ancillary concept. The West came to basically dominate the East, and this was done in a systematic manner, which is the hallmark of imperialism. You do things in a systematic manner, and basically you spread your dominion, your power over a certain part of the world, which becomes your dominion. So the word hegemony is very important. I would also like to mention something I think I mentioned to my own students, which is section 2, if I remember correctly, and that is that the other has become a very sort of current and useful concept. Or tool, which actually became so, since the publication of this book in 1978, even the verb to other has become an accepted verb. When you're othering someone or something, you are trying to emphasize the dissimilarities rather than the similarities. So you are exoticizing somebody or someone or something by othering it. Even in Arabic, the word al-akhar now means much more than somebody who is not you. Al-akhariyya is also a concept now in Arabic, which is basically the translation of otherness. And for example, it's the title, Al-Akhar is the title of a very important movie, which is a little bit about that was done by Yusuf Shaheen in 1999. A little bit now about the intellectual progeny. I talked about the legacy. Where did he get his influences from for his book? And now I'm going to talk a little bit about what effects Orientalism had as a book on the future generations. Orientalism, the book now, has been extremely influential, but also controversial. You know what that is. It's a book that has stirred up a lot of debates. And a lot of people became immediately like sort of post-Saidian critics. And others, of course, tried to find all kinds of faults in his book, but mainly also for other reasons that lie outside of academe in a very narrow sense of the term. So basically, what this book did is to usher in what we call the era of post-colonial studies or post-colonial theory. Okay, because it is a post-colonial view of how the West has viewed the East, and this is very important. It was groundbreaking, to say the least, and it's been very inspirational for many people. Two critics. Said the following, in order to explain why this book has been inspirational for other people's shu'ub, which are also oppressed or feel oppressed by the white superior sort of European or Anglo-American masters. One quotation says, Native Americans, Africans, Asians, Latin Americans, and other colonized peoples and oppressed groups located in Orientalism, a method to challenge a chronic tendency of the West to deny, suppress, and distort their cultures and their histories. Okay, so a lot of sort of oppressed peoples found a voice in that book. The book has been translated into over 40 languages, even Korean, that came out in 2011. You can read it in almost all languages of the world. In Arabic, it's called Al-Istishraq, by the way, and you can read it in Arabic if you so wish. And of course, it has spawned many other critics, as I said earlier. Okay, Said was interviewed, of course, many times over his during his life, and he explained sort of what the impetus was behind the book. He was asked, okay, so what made you sit down and write this book, which came out in 1978? Of course, we write books for a reason, not only to get promoted and tenured, and we write books to satisfy a certain calling, right? That is inner, not necessarily only an external calling that your métier calls for. And he said that, well, Orientalism is something he conceived of in the wake of the 1967 war. You are too young, but I'm sure those of you who read or who come from certain, homes or home educations should know that the Arabs were dealt a very horrible defeat and Naksa in 1967 when Jamal Abdel Nasser was the president of Egypt. So, and of course, it came from Israel, that defeat. The event created, according to Edward Said, a very strong and staunch anti-Arab sentiment in the United States, even in New York, considered cosmopolitan where he was living at the time. So much so, he said that he came to both appreciate and defend his Arab identity, something he never felt compelled to do before that date in the American cultural and political context. And so Palestine, he says, where he was born, and by extension the Arab world, transformed within him from a memory that he left behind into a reality that he needs to both embrace and defend. So he wrote, quote, much of the personal investment in this study, Orientalism, derives from my own awareness of being an Oriental as a child growing up in two British colonies, Palestine and Egypt. And so he was made to feel like an Arab, especially so in the most negative of the senses after 1967. So what does Edward Said mean by the term? What is Orientalism? Now we come perhaps to the sort of nuts and bolts of the concept. Orientalism is a discourse. By discourse, I mean khitab. The Arabic translation is khitab. And by khitab, I don't mean khutbah, which is to stand up in front of someone and give a lecture like I'm doing now. Even this is not a khutbah because it's not a sermon or anything like that. But a discourse is a khitab. This is what we refer to it in Arabic. So it is a discourse that encompasses, in general terms, a whole, in his opinion, a whole constellation of false assumptions, prejudices, and stereotypes underlying Western attitudes towards the East, which in metaphoric terms includes, as I said, all non-European, non-Christian, non-white, non-middle class countries, or rather whole regions lying to the east of Europe and to the south of Europe. So basically it is a body of scholarship which began to flourish in a systematic manner with Napoleon Bonaparte's expedition to Egypt in 1798. He makes a big deal out of this. Napoleon Bonaparte, before he became emperor, actually. I think he became emperor in 1804, after the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror of 1794. And these are things that you know about, of course, from history classes or from your high school history classes. You have the rise of Napoleon. And he arrives in 1798 with many, many ships. And Edward Said sees in that the beginning of Orientalism, because he did not only arrive with soldiers to colonize Egypt, but he came to basically systematically dominate Egypt, and that also includes a form of cultural imperialism and not only political hegemony. So basically, this expedition to Egypt of 1798, he says, is marked by, quote, a subtle and persistent Eurocentric prejudice against Arabo-Islamic peoples and their culture. In The Nation, there's a left-wing political journal called The Nation, to which he often contributed. Edward Said sums up all these negative stereotypes as being mainly those, quote, of oil suppliers or potential terrorists. And unfortunately today, because there are terrorist attacks being carried out around the world, the designation is not going to go away anytime soon. Quote, he says that these essentialized and crude caricatures of Muslim Arab males have largely persisted in the media. He wrote a book, by the way, about the media. And that means photo, print, and electronic journalism, as well as Hollywood productions, despite recent efforts, I believe, by certain, even big-budget filmmakers to portray more recently Arabs as normal, quote-unquote, normal individuals leading normal lives, or at least trying to do so. And some examples that come to mind, perhaps, is the movie Rendition. I don't know if anyone has seen it. It's not a bad movie, 2007, Black Gold, 2011, maybe Syriana, George Clooney, 2005, The Kingdom, 2007. Okay, so these deeply entrenched traditions then of inaccurate images and statements made mostly about the Middle East and Asia in Western culture has served, according to Edward Said, an implicit justification for both European and American imperial projects in the region. Okay, so in other words, we deserve it. Okay, we had it coming to us, right? But of course, the fact that there's oil in the region, the fact that that our markets could serve as, of course, new markets and what have you, not to mention human labor, potential slavery, of course, were added incentives at the time. He argues that in the Western mind, the Orient and the Occident, this is important, in his opinion, have always stood in contrast to with one another as oppositional terms. Now I would like to think a little bit back on Nietzsche. Nietzsche wrote many books, parts of which we read. We read a few excerpts, and those came, I think, from what was the title? Not The Birth of Tragedy, the other one. Okay. Beyond Good and Evil, right, exactly. And in that book, he had argued that part of the epistemological error since Plato was for thinkers to always think along sort of dichotomous lines, to think of something as being superior to its negative polar opposite. And pretty much this is what's going on here. The West always saw itself as sort of the positive counter image to the negative lower image that is, of course, connoted by the East. So from a Nietzschean epistemological perspective, this makes a lot of sense here, of course. If you remember, Nietzsche also had said that, the good is always contrasted with evil, the mind with the body, the soul with the instincts, and the afterlife is superior to this life. And the same thing is happening here. This is the same mechanism that Westerners, according to Edward Said, thought of themselves vis-a-vis the Orient. They are the superiors and we are the inferiors. Okay, so this is very important. And also one thing that Edward Said kept saying in his classes, not only in his book, is that Europe came to define itself by not what it is, but by what it is not. So if the East is dirty and backwards and filthy and despotic, that's because Europe is progressive and clean and democratic and. It's sort of like scratching your ear this way instead of this way. So you define yourself positively by saying what you are not in comparison to that which you know for sure, which of course isn't the case, as being descriptive of some inferior entity. So this is important. One of his very important and significant and sort of eye-grabbing and attention-grabbing quotes from this book is that the Orient was Orientalized. He says that the Orient was Orientalized, okay? So it was made to look even more and sound more Oriental than it is. Again, this is othering. This is the mechanism of othering. It was made to look even more different than it is in order to remain a counter-image of Europe. I would like to mention Freud here to invoke some Freudian terminology with which I hope you are still familiar from the book Civilization and Its Discontents. And if you remember, Freud had talked about sort of the unconscious, right? The unconscious drives, especially Eros and Thanatos, which he believes are the sort of the new 20th century gods or demons that inhabit us and influence every action, which of course is very reductive in my opinion, but nonetheless, even without our being conscious of this happening. So here I would like to say that, and Edward Said, by the way, did like Freud to a certain degree, and he does invoke Freud himself. Here you can say that what is happening is that Europe itself saw the East from the point of view of a collective unconscious, if you like, okay? That is, the East came very quickly to denote or connote, rather, a very specific topography for the European mind. And this is basically to say that the Orient became quickly a place that in which you as a Westerner can go and get away with anything you wish to accomplish. So it became a playground. It became the place that you go to in order to exercise collectively or personally your Eros and your Thanatos, okay? Because nobody is there to watch you, nobody is there to take account of your action, you're not responsible, you're anonymous. Anonymity, of course, gives freedom. So the Orient became saturated with all these images of sexual lasciviousness and excess. I would like to draw your attention, for example, to this painting here that is in front of you. I'm sorry it's not in color, it's originally in color. And basically what you have here is, it is very safe to say that no Westerner would have been allowed into such a closed setting. Okay, so a lot of these paintings, as Edward Said would argue, are basically emanating not so much from a lived reality, but rather from the actual mind and repressed desires and fears of the painter himself or herself. In most of the cases, they were male. So here, for example, you have what looks like some kind of a sultan, a pasha, a man obviously enjoying power, who has his own concubine to his left. And what do we have in front of him? What do you see? What deal is being struck here? Okay, you have a nude woman, right, who is trying to cover her face, right? Which is very interesting. This is what you see people do today in front of cameras, especially if they are like basically being taken to prison or they've just been apprehended by the police or something. She doesn't want her face. She's trying to protect her face. She can protect her body. She can protect her dignity as a sex slave. The least she can protect is her identity. And therefore, she's trying to cover up her features, which is kind of interesting. And you have this old man who is obviously into sex trade, okay, and he is bringing her as probably like the most recent trophy that this man, again, half naked himself, is willing to negotiate with him. So again, this shows you not exclusively, but it gives you a sample of what many of these paintings actually sounded like and looked like, you know, to emphasize how the East is very much immersed in its own sort of sexual lasciviousness and promiscuity and this and that, when in fact it told much more about the inside of the painter, the inner side of his fantasies rather than any lived reality. Another one that I could also point your attention to is the next one, which I find is absolutely fascinating, even more fascinating. This is the inside of a hammam, okay, a bath, a public bath. And of course, needless to say, no Western man would be allowed. So clearly, this is again being done in a derivative manner, okay? So you have two women, almost again naked or half naked, and you have this sort of black figure approaching them with what looks like an argile for them to enjoy while they're sort of relaxing in the hammam. And what is interesting is that the head is cut off. I mean, this is not an incomplete painting. This is a painting that has not been cropped. This is the actual painting. And it makes me wonder, like to a certain degree, to what extent perhaps the painter himself, who had no access, no physical access to these closed places, perhaps was imagining himself as being inside the painting by not revealing the identity of this sort of black intruder that is of course, you know, a servant here, bringing something for them to enjoy, to consume, but nonetheless could be emblematic of the painter himself trying to intrude on a painting, whose actual place he has no access to. Only, of course, Western women were allowed access to these places. Okay. So, in other words, Orientalism, when it was published, back to the book now, sold, of course, in a big way. I would like to mention also a little bit Death in Venice, although I didn't read it with my own students because we had so much else to deal with. Venice also in a way resembles the East because it is the counter image of Munich. It is where Aschenbach goes to relax and to find sort of an alternative identity for himself as a writer. He falls in love with Tazio, and of course he dies in Venice, okay? So the East is a place that could give you a lot of freedom, give you a lot of physical and sensual pleasure, but could also devour you. Okay, so there's that downside to Eros and Thanatos, of course, that Freud himself talked about. If you give yourself totally into your desires, you might actually undo yourself in so doing. I would also like to mention here Benjamin Disraeli. He was a writer in his own right and eventually became a prime minister in England in the 19th century. And he coined the beautiful sentence, beautiful for its veracity, not because it is essentially or intrinsically beautiful. He said, "The East is a career." The East is a career. People now go there as colonial officials, as painters, as poets, as compilers, as theorists, in order to gain something from that place. Okay, so in short then, in insisting on seeing and representing the Orient not as it is, this is the main point of Orientalism, as in the real Orient, but rather as the Europeans liked to imagine it as being a place devoid, empty, devoid of a historical trajectory, and steeped instead in an eternal present, with no vision for a better future or any future. This is another thing. They like to see the East as a place that is stagnant in time and place, that doesn't move forward, that is in many ways sort of, an element of like representing stasis itself. And this again brings to mind perhaps here Simone de Beauvoir, who talks about women and the principle of the eternal feminine, which has been used unfairly, of course, because it's simply untrue, which basically holds that in patriarchal societies, women tend tend to be seen as immoving and immovable, and they are, of course, immanent, and they don't change because of their fixed psychology, biology, and economy, and therefore, unlike man, who moves along history, in fact, moves history and makes history, women are simply the objects of and in history. So the East, in a way, has all of these feminine qualities that Simone de Beauvoir says have been unfairly and erroneously attributed to women in her book, The Second Sex. That is another analogy and a very important one that you should think about now that we are reading this book following Simone de Beauvoir's treatise. The Orient, another big quotation from the book, Edward Said says, the Orient is less a place than a topos. It is less a place than a metaphor. The metaphoricity of the place overrides its reality. Nobody is interested in the real East. They are all more interested in benefiting from a certain view of the East that would further their power. Okay, so some of the main definitions of this discourse. I am now on D, letter D, like capital D, main definitions of Orientalist discourse. Edward Said says Orientalism as a discourse is, quote, a style of thought. It's a style of thought based upon an ontological and an epistemological distinction made between the Orient and the Occident. The Occident is the West, okay? So there is this, and the twain shall never meet, okay? So in other words, they are there and we are here and we can go there and do whatever the hell we want there, but they will never be like us, because then we wouldn't even have a place there anymore. Another definition he gives of Orientalism, he says it's a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. And by that I mean, again, political, military, but also cultural hegemony, or cultural imperialism, which is the title of another book of his, by the way. Okay, a little bit about the structure of Orientalist discourse. This is very important. I am now looking at E, capital E, on your fly sheets. What is the structure then of Orientalist discourse? Edward Said argues that Orientalism as a discourse is divided into three components. This is really important. These components might seem to be different on the surface, but they are in fact mutually reinforcing entities. The first one is simply academic. Orientalism has an academic component to it. This basically means all Westerners, be they American or European, at some point deciding to study some aspect related to the Middle East. Okay, now we call this area studies or Middle Eastern studies. And this could be the Quran, this could be Islamic tradition, this could be the Hadith, this could be anthropology, this could be any aspect. It could be a literary exploration of, of the so-called, literary jewels of the Middle East or what have you, or of course the Far East or Africa. The second one is called imaginative. So the second component, this is imaginative. This, what is in front of you here on the big screen, is an example of millions of what he would call imaginative Orientalism. This is how the Orient came out to be, how it was represented, represented. Representation is a representation of something. In paintings, in poetry, in opera, in music. I mean, Mozart also, for example, wrote some operas that were sort of inspired by the East. The third aspect is the one that we can sort of understand the most, and that is the historical material aspect of Orientalism. This is basically what I call the boots on the ground. The boots on the ground. This is imperialism. This is when they came and they colonized, of course, vast swathes of the inhabited world. By the beginning of World War I in 1914, 85% of the world's land mass was occupied by either France or Britain. That should tell you something. Now, the most interesting thing is that these three components, the academic, the imaginative, and the historical material, are, as I said, mutually reinforcing. Again, it's sort of like the snowball effect that I mentioned earlier, and they serve as a perfect example of the connections among history, society, textuality, and imagination. Edward Said does not like to make a distinction here. So in other words, if you are in the East, if you have boots on the ground, say in Egypt, then of course academic Orientalism is going to flourish because you're already there. You have access to all the temples and to stone Rosetta and to the hieroglyphics and what have you. And of course, when you are there, you are also going to produce art inspired by the East, which itself will further the academic exploration and what have you. So these three are not to be seen separately, but rather as one, as cogs in the same wheel, so to speak. The other point I would like to mention falls under E2, and this is when he says that Orientalism also has two faces, or facets, if you like, or two faces. One of them is latent, and one of them is manifest. I would like to mention here again and sort of prove to you again how much he was influenced in some ways by Sigmund Freud, because Freud had used these two adjectives to describe dream interpretation, where he would say that we dream certain things and we remember the dream content, which is the manifest dream, which we need to psychoanalyze to go back to the original script, which is the dream thought, and which is equivalent here to the latent level of Orientalism. What this basically means is simple. These are fancy terms, but the idea is very simple. Basically what he's saying is that when you look at cultural artifacts, when you look at anything produced by a Western man or woman, inspired by the East, whether they went there or not. Many of them did not even go there. You call them armchair travelers. They were just like, they wrote in a derivative manner. They never even went there. Some did go. For Edward Said, it doesn't make much of a difference because the approach is always textual, okay? And they go there with so filled with stereotypes that even an actual historical encounter may not end up helping you unlearn and or modify what you already arrived with by way of prejudices. So Edward Said would say, when you look at a painting like this one, and when you listen, so for example, to a sermon or to a speech being given by Winston Churchill, and when you compare these two to what do I know, to an opera by Mozart, he says, on the surface of things, they are all three very different. This is manifest Orientalism. One is an opera, one is a painting, one is a speech by Churchill. However, he says, if you dig deep enough, if you read between the lines, if you look at intertextuality, if you are a comparatist, and have a comparatist mind, then you will realize that despite the surface differences, they are all in a way connected to one another by a certain subliminal undercurrent of assumed superiority. In other words, even so-called innocuous products of art are in fact the output of people who must have felt superior on some level or another for them to be produced in the first place. So this is a very important point. So the latent level of Orientalist works, letters, sermons, paintings, photographs, movies even, that level is unchanging because it is unconscious, it is doctrinal. But the manifest level is changing, conscious, related to form, style, and genre, but ultimately not all that important. Okay, so this is what I wish to say. Another thing I would like to mention under 3 are the two concepts of consistency versus coherence. And this is where Edward Said says, when you look at all of these products that were produced about the East by Westerners, you will see that they are much more related to one another than any of them being truly interested in saying something truly new, genuine, and fact-based, derived from some actual encounter with the East. So this is important. So the internal consistency or the coherence of the body of Orientalism overrides any sincere attempt at establishing a corollary or an actual correlation or an actual correspondence between the researcher and the object of inquiry, which is the East in this case. So they're much more concerned with themselves and with appearing credible, vis-a-vis, say, other travelers or other scholars or other compatriots than they are with any genuine relationship that leads to actual paradigm-changing findings with regard to the East. This is very important. Two more very quick things. One is called, I'm looking at 4A. He comes up with two different terms. One is called strategic location, and the other one is strategic formation. And these are, again, fancy terms for things which are really not all that difficult to understand. Strategic location simply means the relationship between the author and the text, the author and the painting, the author and the letter. And he believes that they all wish to appear as being objective, okay? Although I was trying to argue opposite to that line of thinking here by saying that maybe he's actually injecting himself into the painting. Anyway, so the idea here is that as long as you are somehow outside of your painting, outside of your letter, that you are objective and therefore you have authority over the East. Strategic formation is simply how all of these products relate to one another. And as I said earlier, that they are much more concerned with the glue that ties them together than they are with any external reality attached to the East itself and any kind of actual representation of facts. Okay. The book is divided into 3 chapters. The scope of Orientalism, chapter 1, chapter 2, Orientalist structures and restructures, and finally Orientalism now. And I am not going to go into any of these except to say that if you ever have the time and you wish to actually sit and read through this book, which you will probably have to if you pursue anything in the humanities or even in the social sciences, you will realize that Said's genius is precisely in the way he links people going all the way from Balfour to Napoleon to Chaucer to Shakespeare to to Lord Byron, Kissinger, Dante, and others. I mean, if you read the book as a whole, you will realize what I'm talking about. Okay. I would like to just say a few things about the reception of Orientalism, and I'm now looking at G. As I said, this book was either seen as a paradigm shifter, as groundbreaking in charting new territory called Orientalism and post-colonial theory. But then, of course, you always have others who are going to try to find some faults in it. And some of the things that people found faults in this book, I'll give you just a few examples. Some of them would say, for example, oh, how come he talks about how the West looks at the East, but he doesn't talk about how the East looks at the West, as though he is supposed to do everything in one book. Others would say, but he didn't take history much into consideration, that he was very much text-obsessed and text-based rather than history-based. Some would say, what about women? What about the role of gender? Did women look at the East differently, even if they were Europeans, compared to their male compatriots? Is a question that a lot of feminists, for example, critics have raised. What about the element of social class, other people asked? What about Europe's internal others? I mean, Europe looks down on Ireland, did look on Ireland for some time. What about Scotland? What about the Welsh within the United Kingdom? So what about other internal others as well? Okay, since there are only like a few minutes left, I would like to come to the conclusion of this talk. And I would like to leave you with 3 questions that you and your professors in your respective sections might wish to raise. One of them is, since 1978, what does representing another culture even mean today in the context of 21st century globalism? After all, he wrote it in 1978. Nobody had a computer in 1978. Nobody had a Twitter account or a Facebook account or WhatsApp or any of these things that we take for granted today in the so-called global village because of our high-speed travel, mass migrations, and other forms of mobility. So do his arguments still hold water for us now that we are, you know, the several decades around since the publication of the book? Second, is the internet and other social media a means of sharpening or, in fact, reducing intolerance? This is a question that only you can answer and ask and answer for yourselves. To what extent do these social media allow you to get to know others? And to what extent do they bring you closer, perhaps, or in fact do the opposite when it comes to other cultures, other religions, other political beliefs, even within the same country, such as Lebanon? Finally, I would like to end with a question that you might want to do as an exercise. Hypothetically, if you as an individual had the chance today to become someone else, someone whom you see as being utterly different from you, somebody when you see from your balcony or when you think about if he or she is not literally around you, but in your imagination would think of as being the exact opposite of you in language, in culture, in religious ideology, in whatever, what would that person be, or who would that person be that you think of as your ultimate other? And if you were to be that person, if you were to inhabit that person's body and soul even, and mind for 24 hours, then what would you try to accomplish so that when you go back to your former selves, you would tell yourself, gee, I have learned something. Thank you very much.